Season 2 of the All at Once podcast is presented by Alan and Beth Stanfield of Stanfield Properties, proud sponsors since the podcast's beginning. Contact Alan and Beth Stanfield for all your realty needs. They're the actual best in every way.
But I thought because what we had been told, our whole ideology, this is my fault, this is the woman's fault, the problem is you.
How you grow again, the garden from dirt.
This is the All at Once podcast for women and those who love them. I'm Kelly Browning.
And I'm Sarah McDuffie. We are God's image bearers, exploring ways religion has been distorted to silence the marginalized and to justify abuse.
We are Christians seeking to comfort, heal, and free people from the pain caused by our own religion. We carry much, like all of humanity, all at once. To God be the glory.
We want you to know that our show is not for little ears. Also, the content we cover may be triggering for those who have experienced trauma.
The people we interview present ideas that we align with, and they also present ideas that make us uncomfortable. I invite you to join us in this discomfort as our views, opinions, and experiences are challenged. So, take what is good and beneficial for you and leave what isn't. Here we go. Meghan, thanks for being on the podcast. And I think I found your podcast whenever I was originally thinking about starting my own. I literally just searched and Googled women who are Christians who also are feminists because there was such very little content out there that wasn't afraid of the word feminism. And so thank you for not shying away from these hard things.
Of course.
The name of Meghan's podcast is Faith and Feminism, by the way, which I think is awesome. It definitely was eye-catching to me. And I was like, oh, this is what I need to listen to right here. So being raised in this kind of fundamental evangelical environment, I realized looking back that I was kind of taught what to believe and that I wasn't supposed to question it. As I reflect back, I remember there were some things along the way that I kind of felt uncomfortable with, but I just kind of bought into the whole thing because I really kind of felt like I shouldn't be questioning these things or exploring other perspectives. So my whole journey into really starting to deconstruct everything and question some of my long-held beliefs that I now no longer hold to fully really started when I had a bad experience in a Christian marriage and with the church as a result of that.
It's a little underselling it, I think.
Yeah. So I was abused by a man who said he was a Christian and promised to love and care for me. And then he became abusive. And when I started speaking up about it, the message that I got from Christians around me was that I needed to be silent and more submissive, and that I needed to care more about managing his reputation than my own safety and sanity. So I'm a little bit ashamed to admit that was the thing that, like, it took me having a personal crisis for me to really start to question and dig into all of this stuff. It was for my own sake. It wasn't because I was caring for other people initially. It was, oh, I experienced abuse. And then I started to go, how many other people are experiencing this? And that's when I really started to dig into all of it. So that was kind of my wake up and smell the coffee moment. But you got into this in a different way. Can you tell us about how you kind of got on this journey?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, I want to say I'm so sorry for how you were treated by the church and by men who had this kind of theology. I wish your story was uncommon. It is not. And so I will get deeper into that, but just really digging into the theology that we have and how it actually primes the ground for abuse, but I'll get there. So I grew up in the conservative evangelical church. I was raised with purity culture, also raised with a very heavy complementarianism, the idea that men were supposed to be in charge of basically everything. and women were supposed to submit to men. Most of my teachings focused on how to be a good housewife and how to serve his dreams and how to make him more comfortable and how to make myself desirable to him. Growing up in the context I didn't see those kind of teachings being told. So for example, when I was like 13, maybe 12, there's a lot of emphasis on this teaching of purity culture. And all of the girls of my youth group had to write this letter to our future husbands about how we were unopened gifts, that we were, kind of shaving our purity for them. Then they sealed it with wax and we were supposed to save it until we got married. But you didn't see any of the men or the young boys writing letters like this, only the women. And so I started to notice this huge difference in the way that women and young girls are treated versus men. I mean, I also saw this when we went to the pool and girls had to be fully clothed with shorts and t-shirts, where the young guys could wear whatever they want. They could wear a Speedo. One time I had a guy show up to youth group in a banana hammock, like a thong. And it was funny. It was funny to everyone, but here the girls are wearing shorts and t-shirts in the pool. So we see all of these definitely double standards. And what I was told is that, well, men, they can't control their thoughts. They can't control their actions. And so we have to do the work for them. So it's kind of this narrative that men are supposed to be in charge of everything except their sexual urges, which obviously sets up a huge problem when it comes to sexual assault and sexual abuse and what we're teaching men and what we're teaching women. So when I was 13, I remember I was reprimanded for wearing a shirt on a mission trip that it was a t-shirt. But when I raised my hand as I grew older, a small sliver of my stomach would show. I was reaching up for my luggage and a small sliver of my stomach showed, and my youth pastor told me that it was shameful, that I would make men do bad things, and just heaped a ton of shame on me. And of course, for the rest of the week, I wore nothing but, baggy gym clothes. And I thought, that would protect me, but it didn't, because a week later I was sexually assaulted by a stranger on the street who grabbed my breast. And so that was my first time feeling immense guilt, because what was my teaching? This was my fault. Men can't control themselves. It's my job to control them. And so I must have somehow caused this even at the age of 13. And so I didn't tell anyone because I felt so much shame about what happened to me for over a decade. Until I was at least 23, I think, because maybe even later when I first started telling people what happened to me. And obviously it was terrifying and I had nightmares after that. And it was just a terrible experience. But the theology I had grown up with taught me that it was my fault. That's just one example. And so when we're talking about the church and sexual assault and sexual abuse, we need to look at kind of the teachings that were given. And so I didn't realize it at the time, but it was as I got older. I went to college, got a degree in journalism right as newspapers were dying. I did have an internship at a newspaper and I hated it. It was very cutthroat, which would make sense because it was an industry that was in a huge flux and transition. And so I said, you know what, I don't know what to do. So, given the options that I had in the church, I really loved God and I couldn't be a pastor, a preacher, a teacher. So I went into missions and that was what was available to me. Through the missions work I did, I had the opportunity to work with a lot of sexually exploited, oppressed women. For so long, I told that small story about me being sexually assaulted. That was not the only time. I had 3 or 4 more times just in my high school, teenage age where I was sexually assaulted or had part of my body grabbed without permission or touched without permission by friends and strangers. And so, but I thought, because what we had been told, our whole ideology, this is my fault, this is the woman's fault. And more than that, we were trained to see things on such an individual level. This is due to individual sin. This isn't anything bigger than you. The problem is you. And so when I got missions, I started to see that this story wasn't unique to me. In fact, what was happening around the world in every country I'd been to, I went on a program called the World Race, which I went to 11 countries, was that this story that had happened to me was happening again and again and again and again, and actually in a much more extreme way. So I encountered female genital cutting and mutilation, and I encountered rape, and I encountered girls fighting to get an education. And it was through that experience that I started to see, number one, that this is not, you can't tell me this is just individual. This is, most women I come into contact have a story like this. Yeah. Why is that? And so I started asking the question why. And when I started asking the question why, I started to see that this is a lot bigger than what we've been told. This is actually due to a way of thinking, a way of theology, namely patriarchy. And to define what patriarchy is, it's a system built by men for men. And so if we're looking at the world as a whole, we live in a very patriarchal world. And, you read the Bible and it's, we're supposed to be better as Christians, right? We're supposed to be more liberated and have a gospel of liberation. Yet I was finding that the church was one of the greatest upholders of patriarchy. And this became crystal clear to me. I did missions for 5 years, mainly working with sexually exploited women. And I was leading a trip and we were in a bar. The organization I partnered with gave women an opportunity to leave the sex trade and get a full college education with safe houses and providing for dependents. It was a really incredible organization. And this American guy and his American buddy called us over. These were the men who were buying these trafficked women. And they asked us why we were there, and we told them. And we turned the question back on him and asked him why he was there. And he went on this really long tirade about how women here, I was in the Philippines, were raised right. Women who are sex trafficked were raised right, and they knew how to respect men. And that everywhere else, women didn't know how to respect men. And so he came to the Philippines, to these sexually exploited women, to get the respect that he deserved. And he kept on going on and on about how women didn't know their place and how women need to, just this idea of respect. And as he's going on, it hits me that he sounds just like all of the evangelical pastors I had growing up. And it hit me that this problem, I had been working to fight sex trafficking for the last 5 years. And what I saw is that we could rescue a woman or help give her the resources she needed to get out, but she would be so quickly replaced. And that we weren't going to make a difference until we fought the demand. But I didn't understand the demand. I didn't understand why men did this. I was told it was due to sexual urges, right? These sexual urges that men had, that they were uncontrollable. But what I saw that night, this wasn't about sexual urges. This was about a man needing domination and him getting the respect that he felt that he deserved. And as I thought back on all of my other interactions that I had with Johns, it seemed to be a common theme. They wanted respect. They wanted to get the respect they felt they lacked elsewhere. As I had that realization, I realized that I was being complicit in a system that harmed men, that I was by being silent, by submitting to men in my life, by feeding into this narrative that men need control and dominance and women need to be submissive and meet that need and be sexually available to them. Because remember, we also grew up with this idea that once you're married, you have to be sexually available to your husband at all times, or he can't control himself and will go cheat on you or get addicted to pornography or something like that. And so it was just this moment of crystal clear clarity. I was like, no, this is not about sexual urges. Like, women also have sexual urges. This is something bigger than this. This is about power and dominance and control. And so once I realized that my church was also complicit, that I was also complicit when I went along with these gender roles, it changed everything for me. I quit my job as a missionary and I started a podcast called Faith and Feminism. I wrote a book.
Women Rising. We haven't said it yet. Yeah. Women Rising is Meghan's
Women
book.
Rising.
Yes.
Yeah, so I wrote a book called Women Rising, kind of just telling the story. It's like, how often does the church, I think, honestly, have a real heart to help sex trafficking without realizing their complicity in a system that creates enormous power differentials that contribute to sex trafficking and sexual abuse and all of these other issues. And this is not just me saying it. Like, this is a researched like researchers, psychologists, sociologists are all coming away with sexual assault is not due to sexual orgy, but actually due to power differentials. And so there's one psychoanalyst, her name is Lynn Yonak. She does a lot of study about this. She wrote an article in Psychology Today about it. But this idea that women need to submit and men need to be in charge contributes to enormous power differentials. And if power differentials are what causes sexual assault, then we really need to look at the fruit of this gender role theology that we've been given. So, I mean, that's just a brief bit of my story and how I got into it. But I think the overarching message is I grew up being sexually assaulted and sexually objectified. I thought the story was just mine until I found the story again and again and again in other women's stories, and having the profound realization that it was actually due to the system of patriarchy, to the power differentials that patriarchy created, that we were experiencing this in the first place, and that the church and I was complicit in these scripts.
Can you talk about specifically what was it for you that made you realize fighting the demand for sex trafficking meant fighting patriarchy, both inside and outside the church? What moment was that for you?
I mean, I think it was the moment that I shared earlier where that man said he came to get the respect he deserved, and he sounded just like my evangelical pastors. I think I had been around similar ideology my whole life, but for some reason it hit that time. And so for me, how many of our churches will give thousands of dollars to fight sex trafficking, but they, from their pews, preach a theology of women's submission and men's dominance. I mean, it's just like throwing money at a problem without asking the why of the problem. And so for me, I think we really need to examine these teachings that say that men should be powerful and that women should be submissive. I know all the time we hear teachings, and what you received, a woman is being abused, and we're like, okay, be more submissive. Like, no, that is not going to help anything, because a man is not being abusive because women are not being submissive enough. A man is being abusive because he has been taught that he is entitled to a woman's body and time and space, and almost like a sense of ownership. I mean, what kind of teachings do we teach in the church except that women are there to serve his calling, that women were made for men? I mean, that is literally the theology. I wrote a post recently where I said women were not created for men. And I got so much pushback from people in the church saying, no, women are there for men. And so I think we need to examine this theology. Of course, men think they own women if our theology says women were created for the pleasure and the use of men. And so I think we need to really examine this. And I think, not only do these gender scripts hurt women, obviously you shared your story. I shared so many stories of women being abused by these systems of patriarchy, but this is also harmful to men. If we look at statistics in terms of suicide, men are far more likely to commit suicide. If you're looking at who is most likely to commit violence, it's men. Most of the mass shooters, I think it's like 98% of mass shooters are also men. And we need to ask this question, is it that men are more prone towards violence naturally? Are they born that way? Or is this something that they're taught? And I would argue this has so much to do with the conditioning that we teach men, that they can't express emotions like sadness or grief or pain because they'll be seen as sissy or soft or womanly. And so they've been taught that the only acceptable emotion they're allowed to express is anger. Yeah. And so we see men, I think, who have human emotions just like anyone else because we're human, and they're told that they need to stuff these emotions down. And so I think that accounts for why we see higher suicide rates and men more likely to commit violence, is because they don't have the tools. They've been told that the tools they use that we all need to use to be emotionally healthy are not available to them. And so it hurts men as well. The system is not good for anyone. And it's creating, I think, a violent society, one where women are not seen as full people and men are told that they, are better than women, that they're closer to God, I feel like we've almost made men mini gods in Christianity. This idea that even women have to go to their husbands to have a relationship with God, like he's the mediator. Like that
is the job of the Holy Spirit. That is not the job of your husband.
Yes, that is not I think that is heresy. And so I think we really need to examine this. How is it that we almost treat men like they're little gods? And you know what? There's actually a really good explanation for this from a historian. Her name is Beth Allison Barr. She wrote the book called The Making of Biblical Womanhood. But this actually started after the Reformation. So those who are familiar with Christian history, we had the Catholic Church that was kind of corrupt, doing all these things like basically finding your salvation through the priest, and the priest would like sell your salvation, like here, tithe the lot and you can get free or whatever. So it had some issues. Like the Catholic Church, the Christian church had some issues. And so we have Martin Luther with the 95 Theses who broke away. And so there's a lot of good things that came from the Reformation. But what it did is it changed priesthood to, instead of the priest, it turned it into like husbands instead of women. And so in that way, it's like men became the priests of the household. And obviously that has been used in a way that has harmed women. And so, but that actually has historical roots. It's not actually biblical roots. This is something that happened during the Reformation. And if you look back in early church history, we see so many women empowered. But so we need to understand our history, and that the system that we're living in today, I mean, it might have some biblical influence, it might have some Jesus influence, but it also has a lot of historical influence, cultural influence. And I think people go around and talk about their biblical worldview without understanding that their biblical worldview is a very cultural worldview. If you go to a different nation and go to a Christian church there, they might have very different ideas of male headship and egalitarianism. And for example, I was talking to a pastor in Africa, and his work is mainly empowering women and girls, like in this patriarchal culture. And he has women leading in his church. And he had American missionaries or visitors come down, and they reprimanded him for having women leadership in his church. And he's like, wait, where are you getting this? And so we need to understand that even the understanding of what we have is extremely cultural.
Yes.
And it's not just simply biblical. A lot of the Bible has been interpreted through white men. And even further than that, if we're looking at, there's another historian, her name is Kristen Dumais. She wrote the book Jesus and John Wayne. And she talks about how the theology we have is actually, again, really, really cultural, and actually really political. A lot, you see this tie between the conservative politics and the church. Well, that was actually on purpose. And so we need to examine this and understand that the faith we've been given, this is not to say that, Jesus, I still believe in Jesus. I still call myself a Christ follower, but I also understand that so much of what I was told as a child wasn't biblical. The church I grew up in wasn't actually biblical. It was cultural. And in the United States, a lot of the things that the church cares about is actually so tied to conservative politics and not necessarily biblical truths.
Yes.
And so I think we just need to examine and understand that there's more than we've been told, but I think we've been so shamed and afraid. We see the way that people who step out get their books torn from the shelf. So even if we talk about, for example, it talks a lot in Jesus and John Wayne about how in the 70s and 80s, like it became also like a huge money-making enterprise. And so we have books like our companies like Lifeway, it's a Christian book. And so everyone got their Christian books from Lifeway, but Lifeway only chose certain perspectives that matched their conservative worldview to sell in their stores. And so we see people like Jen Hatmaker or Rob Bell having their books burned, not being sold. And so these were the ones that were shaping Christianity, these certain subset of voices. There's so much more diversity and life to the Christian faith than what we've been taught, because it's been so guarded, honestly, for the protection of power. And so another example I could literally talk about this all day because I'm still a Christian. I obviously get called people tell me I'm going to hell and that I'm not a Christian all the time. I'm like, you know what? I have read my Bible cover to cover probably more times than you have, like I know my Bible. I know the research. I know the history. And I still call myself a Christ follower because I believe in Jesus and I believe in the way that he told us to live. And I want to follow his teachings, but we're told over and over again that the Bible should be read simply. And I think that is so funny because they clearly do not read the Bible simply. They take these verses that say women should submit And like, that's very clear. But they ignore the verse right after that says slaves should submit. So are you saying slavery is okay? Because simply that's what it means. If you're saying this is simply, or if you take the story of the rich young ruler who comes to Jesus and he's like, how can I be, a better follower of you? And he's like, give everything away you have to the poor. And we don't see Christians doing that. Why are they not doing that? Well, it has a certain context. It was to that one guy at that one time in this one situation. Right. Okay. So you do understand context. You do understand that this was to a specific person, a specific audience at a specific time. Yet you're saying that doesn't apply to other parts of scripture. So when I hear that simple, like the Bible should be read simply, no, there's so much context. There's so much that we don't understand. And we do need to understand the cultural time to understand even what Jesus is saying. So we take the story of Mary and Martha, for example. And I was always taught that story. I don't even know how I was taught it, but it was definitely not the way I think I view it now. But we have the story of Mary and Martha, where, these women live in an extremely patriarchal culture, much more extreme than it is today. Women were not really allowed to interact with men. They weren't really supposed to be outside the house, and especially not outside the house with men. They were supposed to be, essentially the property of men to prepare their house and whatever. And so we have the story of Mary and Martha, and Jesus walks into this house, and we have Martha preparing the home as a good woman should. And Mary is like, you know what, I'm actually going to sit at the feet of Jesus, which is so offensive because she's in the presence of men. She's learning what she's not supposed to do. And to sit at the feet of a rabbi is to say that you want to, one day be a rabbi yourself. You want to be a teacher yourself. So she is breaking with all of her gender norms, these quote unquote biblical gender norms that she was given, like what we would call biblical gender norms at the time. And so Martha's like, oh my gosh, this is so embarrassing. My sister is not doing what she should as a woman. And goes to Jesus and say, hey, Jesus, tell Mary to help me. She's not doing what she should be. And Jesus says, Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken from her. And so I think even in that one story, which of course I was always taught it through a white patriarchal lens, it was never told to me like, whoa, this is actually huge, that Jesus is telling Mary to break with her gender role and it's better. But we never get taught it that way. And so we need to understand that there's so much more to even scripture than we've been told, because there's a cultural context of extreme patriarchy. So there's a bigger story there. But even if we took it in today's patriarchal culture or today's biblical norms, what she's doing is offensive. So how is it better? And so I think we need to ask ourselves these questions and understand historical context and understand and look at the Bible in a new way, and not necessarily in this way that's been spoon fed to us by men trying to protect their power.
There's this part in your book where I loved what you said. Essentially, you said we need to get to the point where we can hear someone saying, stop it, you're hurting me, without hearing, I hate you. And to me, that was just so powerful, because I think that is what people in Christian societies tend to hear right away when they hear people saying, I'm a feminist, or, I'm advocating for women's rights, or I think the patriarchy is harmful. Even if you say both to women and men, they don't really register that it's also harmful to men, but they immediately get defensive and start talking about how you're just hating on men. So can you talk about that a little bit, and just how a better way to look at that, a different perspective?
Yeah. So, I feel like there's so much to be said here. There really is so much. I mentioned earlier that Western culture, specifically white evangelical Christianity, is trained to see everything on an individual level. They do not see systems. And so a lot of my research, I guess, has been done as of late has been done into womanist, which is Black women's interpretation of scripture. And also understanding the difference between this idea of ruler's church versus people's church, which is an idea, I believe, by James Baldwin, but don't quote me on that. I had a guest on my podcast recently. Her name is Rose J. Percy, who does a lot of teachings on this concept versus rulers versus people church. And so just to go into that a little bit, the church has always been used as a system of oppression. This has been happening since at least Constantine's time, where he made Christianity the national religion. And we see governments using Christianity to harm people. And so there's several different examples of this. But if we even look at early missions in Europe in the 15th and 16th centuries, there are these papal bulls, these edicts that people could take over land, and if it wasn't ruled by a quote unquote Christian monarch, then you could take over that land and kill or convert everyone to take that land for a Christian. And so if you look at here in Canada and the United States, even back into the 1800s, the way that people justified stealing and killing, stealing the land of Native Americans and then killing them was because the idea that them as Christians were better. And so ultimately, Native Americans did not deserve their land because they were not Christians. And so this idea of manifest destiny, taking the land for Christians, was how it was defended, and actually defended in the Supreme Court. So there's a case called Meghan Tschanz versus something else, which I don't remember. I write about this in my book. But even that idea, we need to understand that Christianity has been used to oppress, to gain power, to harm people, to commit genocide. What is killing a group of people who aren't Christian besides genocide? And so we need to understand that there's always been a facet of Christianity who has used Christianity to appear holy and good while committing harm to one another, which is totally anti-gospel. If we look at what Jesus says, what are the two greatest commandments? Love God, love your neighbor as yourself. Like, these are the two greatest commandments. And then all of the laws of all of the prophets can be summed up in these two. Do you think it's loving your neighbor as yourself to take their land to commit genocide? Of course not. This is not the gospel. Yet it's been used. And so even if we look at slavery here in the United States, the biggest protectors of slavery and the biggest instigators of Jim Crow were often quote unquote Christians using the Bible to justify the oppression and exploitation of other people. At the same time, there has always been a church of liberators. The biggest fighters, or the biggest abolitionists, were also using their Christian faith to say no one should be in slavery, right? And so we have these two warring ideas of Christianity. One is a church of liberation, and if we're looking at the United States, that church of liberation has been predominantly found in the Black church. If you look at the faith of civil rights leaders, their faith, if we look at Martin Luther King Jr., he all of his work was done because he was a believer in Christ and wanted to live his life according to the teachings of Christ. But of course, when he was alive, I mean, a bunch of Christians said he was a communist. He was calling him all of these names. But he did it because he was following Christ. And so we need to understand that there's always been a ruler's church and a people's church. And again, you're going to find a lot more about this from Black churches. I think along with the tactics of the ruler's church has been teaching people to see everything as individual. We don't see systems. We don't see systems of white supremacy. We don't see patriarchy. We don't see all of these different systems that are in play. And it's funny because the Bible even warns us. It says our battle is not against flesh and blood. It's against powers and principalities. So what is our battle against? Like, people have turned it to mean something else, but I think powers and principalities are quite literally powers and principalities. Unjust governments, patriarchy, white supremacy, but we can't see it because in the white evangelical church, we've been raised to see everything as individual. There aren't systems at play. This is one guy's sin. We keep on hearing stories of men abusing their power in the church. Ravi Zacharias, just recently, the Hillsong pastor. Like, literally, I could go on and on and on and on. We all could, about men in power in the church abusing that power and harming others. And everyone keeps saying, well, it's just an individual sin. Let's forgive him, whatever. Cool. Like, I'm all about forgiveness. But what I am not about is not asking why and asking, why does this keep happening? And so it's taking that idea that this is just, Ravi just had a mistake. It was his just individual. He's only human. Oh, this guy only had a mistake. He's only human. Why do we keep on hearing this story? Well, this is because this is a lot bigger than this one guy. This is because of cultural messages that we have received of how to behave in the church and the power that comes from that. And so when I say that we've been raised to see things on an individual way, we've been told everything is an individual's fault. When we see what women continually abused by their husbands, it's because the husband isn't following God close enough, or the woman isn't being submissive enough. But the whole system is patriarchy, and patriarchy is what's actually causing harm. And so I talked earlier about how power differentials contribute to abuse. And so for me, what I want the church to see is ask the question why, and then to see the systems at play. And so when people say women's rights and people are like, oh, you can't be feminist, feminists hate men. No, I think what you're having a problem with seeing is that there's a system in play. When we talk about bigger things like feminism or Black Lives Matter, they're talking about the system here. A bunch of people aren't dying at the hands of cops just because, this one guy did something wrong. This is a system at play. And that's what they're trying to say when they're saying Black Lives Matter. This keeps happening. There are systems and powers in play that makes this keep happening. And so when we say that, when I say I'm a feminist, what I'm saying is I keep on seeing a system where men are abusing women. This is just like undeniable. This is like statistically, I could back this up all day. And so what I'm saying is we need to change the system of patriarchy because this is harming people. And so it's so funny because I hear all the time, oh, you're just a man hater. No, like I said earlier, what you mentioned is when I am asking someone to do better, it doesn't mean I hate them. And it doesn't even mean I'm necessarily critiquing them. Because I'm saying women's rights and you're taking it as an individual insult. No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying there is a system that continually hurts women. This is not about you. This is about a bigger system that I'm talking about. And so I think it's funny because when we think about how we would want to improve, say, how do I improve as a person? I have to, number one, become self-aware, become aware of my flaws. Maybe I'm, struggling in some area. How do I improve except by being honest with myself and then working to make it better? And we can understand this concept on an individual level. If I'm struggling with something, of course, it makes sense to want to make it better, but we fail to see that it works the same way with systems, and we can't get better until we acknowledge what's wrong. And so I think people fail to see that. They fail to see the system. They take it as an individual insult. And if we're looking, I think from a biblical worldview, which again carries so much ammunition with that, but if we're looking specifically at the Liberators Church, the faith of Black folks, of the faith of civil rights leaders, they talk about systems all the time. They understand this. And so for me, that's my hope. When I say I'm a feminist, when I'm saying men are hurting women, I'm not talking about that one guy that hurt that one guy or that one guy that hurt me. I'm talking about the fact that this is happening again and again and again. And this is not due to an individual sin. This is due to teachings that teach that men are better than women, or that men are more powerful, or they're more adept, or they're better leaders, or they're better speakers, or they're better whatever. This is all contributing to a system where women are seen as less. We can even see in our culture, we're raised with ideas that, phrases like, don't be a sissy, like being a woman is bad. Like it's everywhere, all over. We have been taught in our society that being a woman is less than being a man. And that is where the harm comes from. Little girls are told they can have male superheroes and women superheroes to look up to. But if a little boy has a woman superhero to look up to, he's made fun of. This is all pointing to the fact that though as a society, we don't want to say it, it's obvious that we view women as less than men. And of course, that contributes to the harm of women.
So Megan, what happened when in your personal story, what happened when you started speaking up and resisting the patriarchal teachings of the church and Christianity?
I think we all know what happens. I think everyone knows what's going to happen, right? We've seen it happen to so many other people. Like we saw, again, I already mentioned some major, evangelical players that were outed when they stepped outside these bounds of white evangelical Christianity. So that happened to me. I was told I was going to hell by a lot of people. I was told I was a false teacher. My family is still super disappointed in me. I just wrote a book and I don't think any of them are going to read it. I think they're embarrassed that I haven't changed I got married 4 years ago, but I didn't change my last name. And so my last name is attached to them, and I think it embarrasses them. And I had friends who I'd been friends with for a decade who told me they couldn't be associated with me because they couldn't be tied to the liberal agenda. They couldn't support me because I was now the liberal agenda because I believed in rights for women. And again, I want to emphasize the tie between conservative Christianity, like conservative politics. The fact that, I mean, my friend, she was upset that I believed Dr. Ford. How could I not believe Dr. Ford after spending 5 years listening to the stories of sexual assault survivors? How could I not believe her when her story sounded like so many of the other stories I heard before?
Can you remind our listeners who Dr. Ford is?
Okay, so yeah, during the Kavanaugh hearing, so Brett Kavanaugh was a candidate to be confirmed for the Supreme Court. He now is, but in 2017, he was accused by a woman of sexual assault, attempted rape, is what I would call it. I think they called it attempted rape. I'm not sure. But Dr. Ford, when she was in high school with him, I guess I should say claimed that he tried to rape her. And she got away. It created a huge storm. Conservative evangelicals, most evangelicals believed Kavanaugh, that he should be confirmed because he was conservative and would uphold their values. They didn't really want to listen to Dr. Ford. They said she was being paid to speak up. But hearing her story, I saw nothing. A woman who is clearly successful, who's a doctor, who's a professor, I cannot see a motivation of throwing your life and having to move. They had to move into a safe house because there were so many threats against them by Christians because they said she was lying. There's so many stories of women coming forward. Like, let's talk about Rachel Denhollander. She was the first gymnast to come forward against, well, she actually wasn't the first gymnast to come forward. She was like the sixth, but no one believed the other gymnasts. But she also was told she was lying, that she was doing it for money, all of these things. And the common thing we hear when survivors come forward, especially if it's years and years after the initial things, people are like, well, why didn't you come forward earlier? And oftentimes they did, and no one believed them. So with Dr. Ford, people are like, why are you coming forward now? Well, he's trying to be confirmed for the Supreme Court. I feel like this is a good time to come forward, even if it wasn't believed before. And so for me, I believed her. I worked with women. Her stories sounded just like them. And I believe women. In fact, when we look at the statistics about the number of women who are telling the truth when they come forward, not to mention all of the extreme cost, how there's a huge cost to coming forward. I shared my story. I didn't even come forward about my sexual assault necessarily. I told friends about it, but it took me 10 years, 10 years to come forward. Why? Of course, women will wait because we see the way women, it's blamed them. There's shame heaped upon them. And so, yeah, I believed Dr. Ford. And when that happened, I had a friend message me and say that I was the liberal agenda and she couldn't be associated with me. But again, this phrase, liberal agenda, because I believe women, because I believe survivors, I am suddenly reduced to a liberal agenda, which shows me again that your politics, if this is just simply about the gospel of Christ, there should be people that are conservative and liberal, and that shouldn't be a problem to you. Right. But it was, and that's what made her come against me. But again, the statistic everyone showed, 95 to 99.5% of women who come forward are telling the truth. And if we even adjust it for the number of women that, don't come forward and the courage it does come to take, like those rates are super high. It's very uncommon, almost impossible for a woman to come forward and not have some truth there. All of that to say, I believe Dr. Ford, and people didn't like it. We had to cancel plans home for Thanksgiving because it really upset my in-laws. And even to this day, we have to have very strict boundaries of how we even interact with them, what conversations acceptable. We're now at the point where we will only meet with them in a public restaurant because things have gotten so bad. And it's so funny because we are still Christians, we are still Christ followers, but because our politics might more lean a little left, because we might believe things that are equated with the liberal agenda, we're not Christian. And so I want to point that out, that there's such a confluence between conservatism and Christianity that it's a bigger deal for people if you move to left politics or even a more moderate politics than it is. We have never renounced our belief in Jesus Christ, but you are more upset that I am talking about women's rights, which is apparently the liberal agenda, than you are about me believing in Jesus Christ, because it's almost become the gospel now. And I remember growing up being told you cannot be Christian and a Democrat. It's simply not true. And I'm not saying all Christians need to be liberal or Democrat. I'm saying that what makes us Christians is trying to follow the ways of Jesus Christ.
I agree. What happened for you in this place of conflict and when you're facing all of this backlash and all this judgment from Christians? How did God meet you there?
I actually have a really powerful story about that. I shared the story of how I quit my job after I had that experience with a man and had this moment of epiphany. My goodness, I am complicit in the harm of these women. And so that's when I began to speak up. About a year after I quit my job and I started my podcast, I was saying, I believe Dr. Ford. And I was also about to turn 30. Leading up to my birthday, we were having a lot of conflict with my in-laws, and it was extremely painful. I cannot even describe it. We cried a lot. We didn't feel heard. We felt shamed to the point where it devolved. We kept on trying to make it right, but it devolved to the point where we canceled our flights home or to see them for the holidays. And then around this time was also the Kavanaugh hearings. And as a survivor of sexual assault, to feel not only vulnerable that so much of society said this is fine, but also to feel like, would you believe me if I told you what happened to me? Would you believe me, or would you call me names? Would you send me death threats? It was an extremely vulnerable time on top of feeling rejected by my in-laws to a high degree. Obviously, the reason I began speaking up is because I believed this is what God called me to do. I believe that I finally saw why women were being harmed. And of course, God is for women. Of course, God wants to see their liberation. Of course, he doesn't want to see them be harmed. So I felt that everything I was doing and the reason I had the staying power to do the things I was doing was because I believed in Jesus and because I believed that Jesus cared for women. And so it was a weird time to continually be rejected in the name of Jesus when I was doing everything because of Jesus. And so this came to a head. I already shared it was the Kavanaugh hearings. It was my 30th birthday. And I went to a coffee shop because I was feeling weird and vulnerable and just wanted to sit down and process, have my quiet time like a good Christian woman with God, journaling. What is wrong? I feel so hurt. I feel like I'm following you. Why is everyone against me? And I had a message pop up while I was typing from a dear friend I had been friends with for 10 years. And I thought, oh, this is birthday wishes. This is going to cheer me up. And it was what I mentioned earlier, an email, a really long-winded message saying basically everything that it was so interesting because I was only believing one woman, but she conflated all of these other issues and said God was against me. That was essentially what she said. And because God was against, I guess, the things that I was fighting for, she did not want to support me because she couldn't have her name tied to the liberal agenda, were her words. I felt like I was reduced to the liberal agenda. And I think because I was so vulnerable in this time, I started to question, maybe they're right. Maybe everyone is telling me that I'm against God. Maybe they're right. Why does this keep on happening? I can't take it anymore. And I remember just sobbing and crying and trying to gather up all of my things from Starbucks and running out the door and going to drive home, but crying so hard that I can't drive. I can't even see because I'm crying too hard. And so I'm like, okay, well, I guess I'll just sit and cry in my car until I can stop crying enough that I can see the road. And as I'm just sobbing in my car, thinking that maybe she's right, maybe God is against me, I have a woman knock on my door and I have no idea who she is. I've never seen her in my life. And I kind of look at her in like bewilderment and she's like, keeps motioning, like, come on, get out of the car. And I'm like, well, something feels like I should, something of me was drawn to her. And so, I got out of the car. I'm still sobbing, still covered in snot. And she just pulled me into a hug and said, I'm not going to let you leave here until you know how loved you are. And she prayed Jesus' name over me. Jesus' like pleasure in me. All of these things that I needed to hear, that there's no way a stranger could know. And I'm just sobbing into her shirt while coffee people look on. And there's like snot and mascara. And I don't know how long I cried there to her chest. And I never said, I think, anything, because I was crying too hard. I think the only thing I ever said to her was thank you at the end of it. But I just remember in that moment feeling like I had been rejected by one version of the Christian God and fully embraced and loved and had good pleasure and pride poured over me from another version, to the fact that I felt like God sent that woman in that moment to remind me that I was not alone, that God was closer than my skin. And whenever I start to doubt that God's with me, I remember that and I'm like, no, God sent, and I can't even describe what a divine moment it was for me, that God literally sent a woman to remind me that I was loved and that I was doing good work, and that she was with me closer than my skin when I thought that God had left me. I will never forget that. As I do this work, when I start to doubt, when I start to get those angry emails, it's funny. I just got an email recently from someone who told me I needed to repent a lot, and then ended the email by saying, if I hadn't been raped yet, it was an injustice, and that he could tell by my face that I was a whore. So this was right in the same lines of, the email starts with repent because of Jesus, but you should be raped because you look like a whore. For me now, it's just remembering that God is with me when I doubt my voice. Even the doubt, like even these messages I get are so clear that you don't see women as full people, that it just like, no, it just confirms what I'm supposed to do. And so my faith doesn't look the same way it did a decade ago, but it feels more real and authentic and free and liberating than it ever did. I don't feel like I need to perform to earn God or to earn God's love.
It's innately in you.
Yeah. And it's that love that drives me forward, that I can get those emails and know that God is still with me.
I just want to briefly mention, because one of the things that I've been following with Beth Allison Barr and with Beth Moore and the SBC and Mary DeMuth and all of these people who, some of these people are on our podcast in season 2. So it's very exciting. So stay tuned or listen to those if you haven't yet. But their work, yours included, Meghan, you're included in that. Your work, Beth's work, both of them, Beth Allison Barr and Beth Moore, Jen Hatmaker's work, Mary DeMuth's work, Rachel Denhollander's work, all of these disruptors that are being told to go home and be quiet, they have brought me closer to Jesus in ways that I haven't experienced. They push me into the Word of God. I open my Bible more. I pray more. I speak more about God's love and Jesus's life with strangers than I have in a long time. And so I just want to briefly say that the work of these women, the work of these disruptive, wonderful women is the work of God. And that's the kind of work we saw and we see in the Bible from actual biblical women, is disruptive work from women, disrupting powers and principalities to draw people closer to God's heart and love. And so thank you for the work that you're doing. And I hope that you would remember that word in that moment, because you are doing God's work. It's very good.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. I also get emails from people. It's so funny because I'm being told that I'm leading to people to hell, but I get an email at least, every couple of weeks that tell me, you have brought me closer to God. I was ready to give up on my faith. And the fact that people like you exist are the only reason that I can hold on to it. And so it's so funny because I think I'm sending people to hell, but maybe I'm drawing them closer to God.
For sure. I've noticed this trend where people are just throwing the whole thing out. They're throwing Christianity out because it's hurt them so badly. There are other perspectives.
I do want you, I know we're running up on time, so I would like us just maybe talk 2 more questions, if that's okay. One, because of Ravi Zacharias and all of this information and the Duggars and Hillsong Guy, I was up at like 2:00 with a sick baby last night in the morning, and I was reading about the Hillsong pastor, just light reading to help me go back to sleep. Just kidding, I didn't. But I'd like you to talk briefly about how is purity culture connected to rape culture, because we haven't really touched on that in our podcast in season 2 or in season 1. And so I would love to hear your perspective on the connection between purity culture and rape culture.
I almost feel like purity culture gives men a pass to abuse and then say it wasn't their fault. I mean, even if we look at the phrases we grew up with, don't show it if it's not on the market. Did you guys hear that?
Yeah, I did.
Definitely did. Yeah. And I'm like, wait, well, first of all, my body isn't a market. Like, why are you objectifying me? And why are you saying my body is a market? It's not. And secondly, you think you're entitled to touch something because it's showing? So does that mean you can go up and grab people's faces or their hand? Like, obviously there's boundaries here, but what it's literally teaching is that if you see something that makes you feel something, it's on the market and you can touch it and you can grab it and it's whatever. And so those are the teachings that I grew up with. Like, first of all, my body is not an object. I feel like purity culture sought to stop the objectification of women, but all it did was shift it to little girls. Literally from the age of 12 or 13, women and men are being told that girls' bodies are objects. If you teach a young boy that he's not in charge of his sexual urges, he's not going to be in charge of his sexual urges because you have literally taught him that he is incapable of that. And so even this idea that women are responsible for men and their thinking and their thoughts, it's not only giving harmful messages to women, it's giving extremely harmful messages to men.
Meghan produces and hosts a powerful podcast titled Faith and Feminism, where she interviews people with great insight and perspectives on women's issues, social justice, and the deconstruction of our religion in pursuit of truth. And as if that weren't exciting enough, she's just written and published a book, Women Rising, and you can purchase that book wherever you like to buy books. I highly recommend that you go buy this book right now. Yeah, give it a 5-star review. It is amazing.
Meghan, thank you so much for coming on our show. And as we conclude, where should our listeners go if they want to engage more with you and your work?
Yeah, so you can find me on Instagram or Twitter. Probably Instagram is the most place I hang around. I am a millennial, so I'm on there more than other platforms. But my name is Meghan Tschanz, MEGHAN TSCHANZ. And that's the name of my website. My book is Women Rising, Learning to Listen, Reclaiming Our Voice. If you type that in, it will pop up on wherever you want to buy your book. You can get it wherever books are sold. And I would love if you read it and reached out to me and let me know what you think. And then if you want to follow Faith and Feminism, you can search in wherever you listen to your podcast and just search for Faith and Feminism and you will find it. And we also have an Instagram page also called Faith and Feminism.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Meghan, for being on the All at Once podcast.
Thank you for having me.
God, can you show me how to grow?
Before you go, if you like what you hear, please consider contributing to our podcast via Patreon, which is a monthly giving platform for creators like us. Visit the show notes for details or our website at allatonce.us.
Sarah and I also want to recognize the All at Once team who works tirelessly alongside us. Robin Boren is our marketing director, Molly Bays is our social media manager, Taylor Diggs, our intern, and Maddie Reyna, who designed all of our podcast logos. A special thanks goes out to Alita Caldwell, owner of Funky Monkey, a boutique and shop in our hometown.
There are 2 more people I have to shout out before you stop listening to this episode, and that is Larry's Designs in Friendswood. And lastly, and probably one of the coolest people that I need to talk about is Kate Short. She wrote the music you hear in response to season 1. Check out her hit single, 2 a.m., wherever you listen to your music. Thanks for listening.
While the world keeps on revealing